Because what Lewis Hamilton did on the third day of testing was not simply placing himself at the top of the table. It was to completely change the perception of SF26. When everyone expected Ferrari to continue hiding cards, testing configurations without showing anything serious, Hamilton appeared and left an uncomfortable feeling in the paddock. The car no longer seems experimental, it seems ready. A 1 minute and 34.209 seconds. More than 150 laps in a single day. Constant pace in long runs. And above all, something that Ferrari did not have last year, clarity on the basis of the car. But here's the question that really matters. The third day in Bahrain dawned with a different feeling in the Ferrari pit. It wasn't euphoria. It wasn't a celebration. It was concentration. Because after 2 days where the team still seemed to be exploring limits, testing configurations and accumulating data without revealing too much, the final Friday of testing made it clear that the program had changed its tone. It was no longer just about understanding SF26. It was about starting to squeeze it. From the first outings on the track, the car showed something that was not always present in previous years. Repetition. The SF26 did not seem like a nervous or unpredictable single-seater. He didn't need constant adjustments from stint to stint. Hamilton could go out, complete blocks of long laps and return to the box with clear information, not doubts. And that, in the preseason, is a huge qualitative leap. The figures speak for themselves. 150 laps a day. More than 200 accumulated by Hamilton during the entire test. 424 for Ferrari between both drivers. That volume not only means sufficient mechanical reliability, it means that the car stays within a stable operating window. When a team can repeat simulations without interruptions, it begins to build real trust. And that is where the detail that changed the narrative appears. The rhythm in medium runs. In the final part of the day with the medium compound, the times began to stabilize in the range of 137 and 138. They were not explosive turns. They weren't looking for headlines. They were work rounds. Laps that reveal thermal behavior, degradation, balance in the middle curve and traction in slow exit. Turns that you can only sustain if the car is not fighting against you. What was perceived from the outside was a more usable SF26. That word may seem simple, but in Formula One it is decisive. A usable car is one that allows the driver to build pace, not survive it. And Hamilton started to look comfortable. I wasn't constantly correcting on the steering wheel. I wasn't managing sudden oversteer on corner exit. The car seemed more settled in the rear axle and clearer in the front, allowing for progressive driving. Because the third day was not spectacular due to an isolated lap. It was important for continuity. Because of the feeling that Ferrari stopped testing unknowns and began to validate certainties. Validate that the aerodynamic package works in real conditions. Validate that energy management does not compromise the long pace. Validate that the correlation between simulator and track begins to align. In the paddock, conversations changed tone. There was no longer talk of an experimental Ferrari. There was talk of a Ferrari that had found a base. And when a team finds a base before starting the season, it means that future developments will have a clear direction. SF26 showed no fireworks. He showed consistency. And in a Formula One where differences can be hidden behind fuel charges and unknown engine maps, consistency is the most honest signal that a test can offer. What really surprised was not that Hamilton set the best time of the day. It was that the car seemed to respond every time it was asked to repeat the effort. No drama. No visible shocks. Without that margin of uncertainty that haunted Ferrari so many times in previous seasons. The third day in Bahrain did not confirm that Ferrari is the fastest. But it did leave something much more disturbing for its rivals. It confirmed that the SF26 no longer seems like a project in search of identity, but rather a car that is beginning to understand itself. Because it is one thing for the SF26 to have been consistent, and quite another to understand what that means in the real context of the grid. The third day in Bahrain was not only an exercise in lap accumulation. It was the first moment where Ferrari stopped partially hiding and began to show a more defined version of its concept. And when you coldly analyze what happened on the track, there are 3 points that explain why the paddock began to look more closely at the red box. First, aerodynamic stability. During the long stints, there were no sudden corrections or dramatic variations in lap times. That's usually a clear indicator that the soil is working within a predictable window. In the current generation of single-seaters, where ground effect is everything, losing stability means losing driver confidence. And Hamilton didn't seem to be fighting the car. That, coming from someone who has historically been extremely sensitive to forward balance, is a powerful sign. Second, thermal management. Bahrain is brutal with tires. The abrasion of the asphalt and the high temperatures punish the rear axle, especially in medium runs. However, the SF26 times did not show abrupt drops within the longer lap blocks. We are not talking about obvious superiority. We talk about control. And control is what allows us to build strategy on Sunday. Third, efficiency on the straight without compromising the middle curve. Although in testing you never know what fuel load each team runs with, the SF26 did not seem excessively loaded on the wing or sacrificed in top speed. This suggests that the balance between downforce and drag could be better optimized than in previous stages. If Ferrari manages to maintain that commitment, it can become a versatile car on different types of circuits. But here comes the critical point. None of this guarantees that Ferrari is the fastest, because tests are a game of mirrors. Some equipment hides performance. Others work with completely different programs. Fuel loads can easily distort half a second. Engine modes alter any direct comparison. So why does day 3 generate so much conversation? Because it was not an isolated flash. It was consistency. Ferrari didn't need a miraculous lap at the end of the session to attract attention. The rhythm was there for repeated blocks. And when a car can repeat performance under different track conditions throughout the day, it means that the simulation model begins to correlate with reality. And this is fundamental for Hamilton. Let us remember that your adaptation is not only emotional or strategic, it's technical. It comes from years with a different philosophy. The SF26 requires another way to attack the corner, another way to modulate the brake and the transition to the accelerator. If the car is unpredictable, the process is delayed. But if the car is consistent, the driver can start squeezing tense with confidence. And on the third day, for the first time, it seemed that Hamilton was beginning to understand exactly where the limit of SF26 is. That doesn't mean you've already achieved it. It means you're starting to see it. It is also important to understand the psychological context. The paddock expected Ferrari to remain in the experimental phase. It was expected to see radical adjustments between sessions. More uncertainty was expected. But the closure of the test was ordered, methodical, clean. And when Ferrari finishes a preseason with a feeling of order, the internal message changes. The team begins the season not by asking what is wrong, but rather, how much margin do we have left to unlock? The third day in Bahrain did not crown Ferrari as favorite, but it did alter the initial perception that many had after the first days. And in Formula One, perception also plays a role. Because if your rivals begin to consider that you are no longer an unstable project but a structured threat, they begin to adjust their own strategic reading. Ferrari did not emerge from the test as the team that set the most spectacular lap. He didn't come out with an aggressive statement. There were no exaggerated celebrations. But he did come out with something that Maranello has not always had in recent years, a feeling of control. The SF26 finished the preseason without obvious signs of crisis, without repetitive failures, without desperate changes of direction. And that, in an environment where every thousandth matters, is an extremely powerful foundation. The big difference compared to previous seasons is that the car does not seem fragile in its concept. It does not seem to rely on an ultra-thin aerodynamic window. It doesn't seem to suffer as the track evolves. It doesn't seem to punish the driver excessively when trying to push on long runs. And when a Ferrari stops being capricious, it becomes dangerous. But this is where the great unknown comes in that still has no answer. How much of this performance is real and how much is conditioned by the testing context? Because we don't know fuel loads. We don't know engine modes. We don't know if some rivals were deliberately hiding performance. And Bahrain is not Australia. They are completely different scenarios in terms of temperature, type of curve and behavior of the asphalt. However, there is something we do know. The car allowed to work. And that means that development during the first few races will have a clear direction. It means that Ferrari can arrive in Australia not looking for emergency solutions, but rather fine-tuning details. It means the focus shifts from fixing problems to extracting performance. And in that context, the figure of Hamilton becomes even more relevant. Because if day 3 marked the moment when you started to feel comfortable with the SF26, then the ceiling is still far away. If you were already able to show consistency on long runs during a test, what happens when you have real rating, real pressure and minimum fuel? That's where the story can completely turn. The real message on Friday was not that Ferrari is the favorite. It was that Ferrari does not seem to be improvising. And when a large team begins the season with a clear structure, growth is usually faster than that of those who are still searching for answers. The third day in Bahrain closed with a very different image than what many expected after the first hours of testing. We didn't see an experimental Ferrari. We didn't see a nervous Ferrari. We saw a stable Ferrari. But something became clear on that final Friday. The SF26 did not finish the test as an unknown. It ended as a silent warning. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.